Hello, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is The Slave-Owning South, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you got to know to start understanding this particular complex period. But as we do that, we need to make sure that we go into this with a clear understanding of one thing. The American Civil War was over slavery, all right? It's okay to say that because it's evidence-based, it's fact, there is no debate. Once we make sure that we understand that, once we make sure we're right with that, it's okay to then kind of proceed with studying and thinking about the rest of this. All right? So, first off, the lost cause. Much of what we know, much of what the public tells us, much of what film tells us, much of what public memory tells us, much of what K through 12 told us primarily in southern states, but really nationally, for much of the 20th and into the early 21st century, was defined by the lost cause. Now, the lost cause was a movement and is a movement that tends to advocate positivity and curate memory about the American South and about its leading individuals and institutions before, during, and after the Civil War. They do this through a lot of things. They do this through a lot of ways. But since we're talking about the slave-owning South, naturally, if they want folks to think that either A, slavery wasn't a big deal before the American Civil War, and it was, or B, that slave owners weren't really bad guys, they were, of course they're going to want to curate that memory and try to put a positive spin on it. And so we have seen that positive spin through things like textbooks and monuments and a whole host of other things. Secondly, film. So a big way that lost cause advocates in the 20th century thought that they could get their message out was, of course, through film. And perhaps the biggest way that they did this was through Gone with the Wind. Ugh. All right? Gone with the Wind comes out at the end of the 1930s. It's probably the most popular film on something having to do with the American Civil War in the 20th century. Yes, it's an incredibly difficult film to get through. It's really, 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 really long. But it's also a film that is an apology for the South, apology for the Confederacy, apology for the slave-owning South, and for paternalism and white supremacy. It comes at it from a perspective not of scholarship, but of fetishistic memory for a time period of enslavement and utter brutality. So we need to make sure that we understand that films like Gone with the Wind are not documentaries of everyday life. All right? Third, plantations and space. Those who owned slaves did not singularly live on giant plantations like what you'll see in Gone with the Wind. That is a part of the Southern economy. That is a part of Southern culture, a big part of it. But slave owning was ubiquitous, and it existed throughout what would become the Confederacy, meaning the average individual who owned slaves did not own hundreds of them. And, of course, those who owned slaves also lived in cities, places like Baltimore and elsewhere, New Orleans being a good example. The other thing with that, of course, is that understanding the space of a plantation itself, in many ways it's not a white space, right? It's a black space. It is a space defined by the brutality that is meted out against those who are enslaved in those spaces. Let us not deify the greatness that is a plantation. It is a horrible place. Fourthly, it was profitable. It was very, very profitable. Southerners and others who owned people in the first half of the 19th century did so out of a number of reasons, part of which was their complicity in an incredibly profitable, primarily cotton economy. The capital that they are able to gain and invest not only in land, but again capitalize in people, made them want to expand the system often and always. There is in recent years, or has been in recent years, an effort to say, oh no, slave owners were looking to give up slave. No, they weren't. They were looking to expand it often and always. Fifth, violence. All right? Violence. The lost cause folks have been very successful in trying to convince us that slavery was fundamentally a positive thing and that slave owners had a sort of fiduciary responsibility to their slaves and treating them well, and of course that couldn't be further from the truth. Slavery was an unending horror. It was an unending nightmare, and this we need to account for and we need to understand. The black codes, the slave codes that existed throughout the American South are one part of this, but the violence on the part of slave owners against their enslaved individuals is another part. Most, if not all, slaves were beaten. The role of sexual violence here is also a huge, huge thing. And this is not something to be looked at with glamour in any way. All right. Have a good day.